Hey, well, welcome to our webinar this morning. We're going to talk about, I'm Rob Lynn, by the way. I want to talk about developing leaders by tapping into the wisdom that exists inside the organization, which is a good deal different than the way most leadership development gets done, which tends to be an expert-driven process. And I want to talk about flipping that, because that's a better way to go in my experience. So from my vantage point, who are the real experts on leadership? Is it the academics, the consultants, the celebrity executive authors? Um, and they have a tremendous amount of relevance, no doubt. And we're going to talk during this webinar about the applicability of those points of view. But are they the actual experts that have the most value to provide for any given organization? And my point of view is I don't think so. I think there's a different way to look at that. And I'm reminded of a podcast I was listening to recently, where the moderator of the podcast was interviewing Manoj Bhargava, who's the founder and CEO of 5 Hour Energy. Really interesting guy. And he's talking, and he goes, I didn't know anything about what I was doing when I started this company, and as we've evolved it. He said, but what's the point of following the experts? Is how can you accomplish anything original if you follow the experts? And that I was in my car, and it really, I almost want to pull off the road so I can think about it, because it really got my attention. And it made me think that if you think about the best decisions you've ever made, were those decisions based on some advice that somebody gave you? Or were they based on that inner voice that speaks to you, and you listen to that voice, and you made a choice, and you look back and you go, that was a really smart move on my part. I think if I think of myself, and I bet if you think of yourself, that a good portion of those best decisions you ever made came from that inner voice, and listen to it. And my observation is that organizations have inner voices. And the inner voice of an organization is the voice of the people inside the organization, and not just from the top, but from the middle, from the front line. That's where the collective wisdom of the organization whispers and gives us insight that you can really tap into to guide how you develop leaders in an organization. So I want to talk to you about the concept of looking at leadership development and how you decide where to go with leadership development, with leadership behavior, and turn the whole thing inside out, and not have it be driven from the experts down, but from the wisdom, the inner voice of the organization out. Oh, I missed my. There we go. The experts can add real perspective, but as I'm saying, the real stuff comes from the people on the inside. And by the real stuff, I mean going deeper than research, theory, and really tapping into what's driving success in the organization and what may be dragging the organization down, what's slowing it down. And that real stuff, it means tapping into not just perspectives about what's going on right now inside the organization, but tapping into the wealth of experiences people have in their past. So you really tap into the full depth of the wisdom of an organization, and not just thinking in current terms about what's going on, but these people that populate the organization, they all have deep and valuable histories. How do you tap into that history? And to do that, I like to ask kind of 4 questions to really get to the depth of things when I'm talking to frontline people, middle management, senior management, is I want to know about their best experiences with leadership throughout their entire lives, their worst experiences with leadership throughout their entire lives. I want to stop there for a second. We'll get to points 3 and 4 in just a moment, because I've had situations where we've been doing this with organizations. And when people start telling stories about best and worst experiences, is I've had people tap into something that happened when they were 10 years old on a little league team, both for best and worst. And so what's interesting about that is when you ask those kinds of questions, and you can see people start to really step back from the current conversation and really think deeply about what's got me to where I am, and what do I view as most valuable about how organizations can evolve themselves, and what leaders need to do to help an organization evolve itself, and really tap into the full depth of their wisdom, which is a heck of a lot more than whatever experiences they've had, in that job, in that organization, in current times. So ask them to go deep, both on the best side and the worst side, because certainly from best experiences, you can tap into, wow, let's take that aspect of leadership and bake it into our organization. But you can do the inverse of that with worse experiences. I remember a situation where somebody told a story about a boss they had a number of years back that was very volatile and would yell and berate and that sort of thing. And and he goes, I haven't thought about this in a very long time because I haven't worked in a place like that for a very long time. He said, but one of the things I want to make sure we have in the leadership behaviors here is that leaders never lose emotional control. I want to teach people how to do that. And so the leadership model that we built with that organization actually had that component about leaders maintaining their emotional control. And we would have workshops on how to deal with that, so that that issue of the volatility and the yelling and the berating, never became a part of that culture. Now, on points 3 and 4 there, it is important when you're tapping into the collective wisdom of the organization to look at what's going on in the here and now. And what you want to look at is, what do you want to keep that's really working with leadership that we can leverage? Because one of the things that can happen when you're talking to people in an organization about where the organization should go with its leadership behaviors is one of two things can happen. They focus completely on the negative and all the wrong things, and you risk losing some really valuable things that are happening. So you want to ask that question, what must we keep? But on the other side, point number 4 there, what must we stop? It's also, unfortunately, common for some organizations to just focus on the positive and to kind of believe their own press clippings of how good they are. And they don't think about, all right, if you ask me what we must stop, and you make me give you an answer, the facts are that there are answers there, things that we need to stop doing to really improve some stuff. And some of these things have been buried pretty deep. And I'll tell you a story in a moment about how deep these things can be buried. But if you ask the question, really critical stuff rises to the surface that can unleash some significant value. And I think it's important to ask these questions from the frontline managers all the way up to the CEO. It's super important to get to the frontline managers and middle management. But I think it's worthwhile to have this conversation at the senior executive level as well. Because what are you doing? We're tapping into the full collective wisdom of the entire place, leaders at all levels, because they live different lives. People on the front line have a completely different experience of what's happening in the organization than people in the middle and people at the top. And if we're going to really tap the full depth of the wisdom of the organization, you want to get perspective from all of those vantage points. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories that in my history really stand out to me about what you can unleash when you tap into the wisdom of the organization. And the first story there, as I call the 12 dotted lines, and we were doing a middle manager focus group, asking these questions that I was just describing to you. And one woman in the room stops and she said, and she's starting to cry. And she said, I've got 12 dotted line reporting relationships. I don't have a single hardline reporting relationship. All I do all day, every day, is just spin from who's hitting me the hardest, who's the most senior person or the most volatile person or the person who's articulating the most sense of urgency, and that's what I work on. And I'm just waiting to get fired because there's no way I can satisfy 12 separate bosses. And then the rest of the room weighed in with their perspectives that were very similar. And so what came out of that, and this has been going on for years. And this is what I talk about you really asking them to go deep, and what must we stop? Because that issue had been going on for a long time, but nobody had said anything about it because the culture in that organization was your value was based on just how frequently you said yes and how hard you tried. And so they had embraced that cultural value, and they had never looked at the unintended consequence, the negative consequence of that cultural value. And so we worked on that and eradicated all that excess load. And that organization just transformed. We went from a distant number 2 in its marketplace. Within 2 years' time, was a dominant number 1 in the marketplace. And one of the real linchpins, one of the real catalysts to that success was identifying that issue of just overload. from these really diffused reporting relationships. Next story there is they listened. And this also comes from a middle manager focus group. This is an organization that was in tremendous turmoil. They had just eradicated the full middle layer of the organization. So all the people I was talking to that were, quote, middle management, prior to this eradication of the middle layer, they were all frontline managers. And they were thrust into this much more senior role without any real guidance. And the place was really in a panic. And so we did this perspective building. We built a model of leadership behaviors that reflected that perspective building. And then the next step, after the senior team finalized everything with me, is we were reporting out to that focus group about this is the model of leadership we built based on the input that you guys gave us. This is another example of somebody crying in one of these sessions. That seems to happen a lot. And they were looking at the questionnaire that we built that we would assess people against relative to this new model. And this one woman said, with tears, she goes, "Those are my words right there. in the model we're going to ask every leader in this organization to develop themselves towards. Those are exactly my words." And she said, "They listened. I don't think I've been listened to in 5 years." And then other people in the room goes, "Hey, these are my words, and those are my words." And what you began to get was this upswell of energy and belief that, you know what, things are going to change because they listened to me. And they didn't say these words, but what you can see happening is they respected the wisdom I have to help evolve this organization. I'm all in. I'm all in. I have hope again I haven't had in a long time. And the last story, yeah, you can do that. It comes from an organization where I told you how important it was to talk about what do we have to stop. And there was a focus group there where what came out was one of the things we have to stop in this organization, and it's not so much a leadership behavior as it is an abdication of leadership, is we're this highly touted hospital system. Everybody thinks our hospital is fantastic. But you need to understand something, is we have nurses and housekeeping staff that in the middle of the night will extort money from a patient if the patient wants a blanket because they're cold. Pretty damning issue. We got that fixed with the help of the CEO, obviously. And then we were working through at the frontline management level about how to implement these principles. And one of the principles that was built as a result of that issue of extorting money for a blanket, for goodness sakes, was patient care is our first priority. Now, that doesn't articulate exactly what they meant. That's a poster statement. But if you looked at the behaviors underneath that statement that we were teaching leaders to deploy, it really got to what you do on the floor on a regular basis to interact with customers, with patients in a more caring way. And so we were having a conversation with the housekeeping staff, and there was a frontline manager of the housekeeping staff. He said, this principle about patient care, this is how I see it, and I just want to know if I understand it correctly. So I want to tell my people, my housekeepers, to be paying attention to what's going on with a nurse. And if a nurse needs help, needs me to run and grab a piece of equipment, or answer a phone call, or if the nurse has to leave for a minute, we could even hold the patient's hand, make them feel comforted until the nurse came back. Can we do that? I said, yeah, you can do that. Please come with me right now. We went straight to the CEO's office. His name was Bruce. And I said, please tell Bruce what you just told me. And that was a transformational moment for that organization. And we used that story in trying to teach people around the organization what it meant in this place to really care for patients. And there's no chance that issue, with that degree of just visceral, practical application, would have come to the surface had we not been reaching into the organization, right to the frontline management to say what's going on here that we have to get better at. That's not something you're going to learn from senior management. You got to go deep in the organization to find that. So this wisdom from the inside is completely transformative for an organization, and you're not going to get that kind of transformation, in my experience, from outside experts. And you're not going to get it just from the top of the organization. It's got to come from the depth of the organization to capture the full impact of the wisdom that organization has baked into its DNA. So rely on it because it has been the thing that has made leadership development work that we've done in our organization with my clients be just transformative. So thanks for listening to this, but we have a few questions that have come through, and I want to get to those questions. The first question is, do you actually use expert opinions at all? And if so, how do you use them? Absolutely, we use expert opinions, and different organizations have different experts that they rely on, a book they've read, or a seminar everybody went to. And what I like to do with that is I want it to be a piece of wisdom. I don't want it to be the wisdom that we tap into. It's not the answer. It's a piece of the perspective, a piece of the wisdom that can drive the answer. So the way I like to use it is the same way I would use a piece of perspective from somebody inside the organization. So hey, this is the information that came from your frontline staff. This is the information that came from middle management. This is the perspective that came from senior management. And here's some perspectives from some of the experts on leadership that you guys are most open to and most desirous of learning from. Let's bake all that together and decide what we're going to do here. So we absolutely use it, but it's a piece of the wisdom. It isn't the full body of the wisdom. And then another point here, a question that's come up is how relevant are people's past experiences if they are from situations completely unrelated to the business they're in now? That's a good question. I've had that question more than a few times from clients. And the way I view it is an organization is an amalgamation of people, and those people have deep histories before they ever got to that company and that job. And there's great learning and there's great wisdom from that full depth of experience. And so if we take the example of, I'll give you that Little League example I told you about, where this guy said, I had a coach when I was 10 years old. And what he was fantastic at compared to so many Little League coaches is he made the worst player on the team feel like an absolute integral part of the unit. And that particular Little League had a rule. You could only play, you had to play everybody 2 innings a game out of a 6-inning game. And so all the kids that weren't very good knew they were going to play 2 innings throughout the rest of the league. This team, everybody played at least half the game. And so nobody felt like they were disenfranchised. And so this guy said, I'm going to make sure, like we're a big organization, right? We don't have all A players. We've got a lot of people that are pretty average. But how do we make the people who are pretty average feel like an integral part of the team that is absolutely germane to the success of this place? How do we do that? And we began to think about how do you reach out to a whole organization and really make people feel valued, help them understand their jobs, help them understand the connection between the work they do and the strategic objectives of the organization. How do you make that 2-inning kid feel like a 3 or 4 or 5 or 6-inning kid? And that came from a Little League experience that had nothing to do with the particular business, but it was a breakthrough for that organization. So my experience tells me that the depth of experiences irrelevant to today's job or not drives tremendous progress in an organization. Now, here's a question. How do you get the senior team to listen to other people in the organization? Sometimes that's hard. And one of the ways I like to do that is I want to make sure at least one of the focus groups that we talk to is comprised of people that the senior management has said are the best people from the middle of the organization, or maybe they're lower than that, but they're real high potential people. And I want those names because when we're feeding back to the senior team, this is what the perspective is from other parts of the organization, is when they hear those hard things like we have people extorting money from patients if they want a blanket, they have to know who that perspective is coming from. Because I've seen situations where the senior team will say, well, that's just their opinion. And it isn't really like that. They don't quite see the full picture. And we can go, time out. Let me read you the names of the people that we were talking to that provided this input. When you start reading the names of some of the best, most highly potential people in the organization, it changes senior management's tone pretty fast. Like, hey, if we can't listen to this group of people, Who are we going to listen to? So that's the best hook that I found is make sure as you're going deep in the organization to get perspective, is that you're tapping into some of the best people from outside the senior management team because senior management hear things that are painful. They're not going to want to embrace those things, and they have to know it's coming from really credible sources. Um, this last one's a great question. Um, what if there isn't enough wisdom in the organization? Everything I'm talking about here is tapping in with the collective wisdom of the place. And what if it's not wise enough? I've had that fear a few times um, with clients over the years. And what I've learned is to trust the people in the place. Because if you take them through those questions I described to you um, and let them know that their opinions are going to be used directly into crafting what we're going to ask leaders to do to change the way they lead, to guide the organization forward, is some people that might not strike you as particularly impressive, might not strike you as particularly wise when you initially think about them. For me, they've blown my mind with input. So I've just learned to trust that the wisdom is there in the organization. It's just the job of us as consultants or us as senior management to respect it and go ask for it and then use it when they give it to you and create that situation where they go, hey, they listened. And now we're all in this together as you evolve the organization forward. So thanks tremendously for your time. And I look forward to engaging with you down the road. Thanks very much.